The views and opinions expressed on this program are those of the participants and do not reflect the views of BronxNet or the program underwriters.
BronxNet. Your voice, your views, your vision.
Good evening and welcome to BronxTalk. Last week, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and other organizations filed a federal civil rights complaint challenging the admissions process at New York City's elite public specialized high schools, including Bronx High School of Science, Stuyvesant, Brooklyn Tech, and other schools. Their concern is the strikingly low numbers of people of color who are admitted into those schools. Here are some of the disturbing numbers. The black population in New York City is about 33%, but of the 976 who were admitted to Stuyvesant High School last year, only 19 were African American, just under 2%. And though the Hispanic population in New York is over 28%, just 32 students, a little more than 3%, were admitted to Stuyvesant High School of Hispanic origin. The obvious question, why are there such disparities? And there may not be as obvious answers to the question of what can be done about it. We're on tape tonight, so no phone calls, but in our studio, the Assistant Counsel from the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, Rachel Kleiman. Good evening. Thank you for joining us.
Good evening. Thanks for having me.
And on the phone, an educational consultant and co-author of the book, Exam Schools Inside America's Most Selective Public High Schools. It's Jessica Hockett. Dr. Hockett, good evening. Thanks for joining us.
Good evening. Thanks for having me.
Let's start with you, Ms. Kleiman. Why is this happening? Why are these numbers so obviously out of kilter? It's certainly anybody with a fair mind who would see those numbers would say, wait a minute, this can't be right.
Well, there's probably more than one reason for it, but one of the sort of most obvious reasons is that currently the exam to get into these schools, the only way to get into these schools is one single 2.5 hour multiple choice exam. So no other inputs whatsoever as to whether students are getting into these schools. And so it's this way of assessing merit that just doesn't make any sense at all.
Well, the logical comeback to that would be, well, wait a minute. Here's the test. You do well on the test. You're at a certain cutoff point. If you study well, if you're prepared well, if you're a smart, intelligent young person, then you will do well on this test. What's wrong with that theory? And, so, gee whiz, I'm sorry the numbers don't work out ethnically, but, do better on the test.
Sure. A couple of things about it. One, there's never been any study to show that this test has any predictive validity. So there's nothing pointing out that, hey, if you do well on this test, you're going to do well in one of the specialized high schools. So we don't even know that it's showing anything at all. Second of all, you say, oh, study well, do well on this test. Well, the people who are doing well on this test tend to be those who are getting test prep or coming from private schools. There's no real evidence that this test is aligned to the public school curriculum at all. So instead of saying study well, do well on one single test that we don't even know has any meaning, study well, get good grades, work hard throughout your middle school career, your elementary school career, really show that you have academic merit across multiple measures. That should be the real test of merit, and that's going to enroll a class which is likely, very highly qualified, but also more diverse.
So there's no study that would show, well, goodness, this student did well in high school, passed the test or was accepted into a school, and then ultimately went to a specialized high school, went to the Bronx High School of Science, and then did well at that school and in life. There's no correlation between that lineage? There
may or may not be a correlation, but there certainly hasn't been a validity study undertaken by the DOE to show that the test is actually testing whether or not you could do well in these schools. And since they're relying on it as the sole measure, that's a particularly egregious problem, that we don't even know that this test is testing anything.
I'm just speculating here, and we're going to bring Dr. Hockett into the dialogue in just a moment. If the test is reformed, let's say they say, well, okay, let's take a look at the questions that we're asking. Let's match them up with the curriculums, which now, like it or not, they're more standardized than before. Let's match it up and then make a correlation between students who may do well in high school, they will do well in the test, and then we'd like to predict that they would do well in the specialized high school and beyond. That wouldn't satisfy you, I'm guessing, based on what you say.
No, that's correct. You know, it might be an improvement. We might get a better test, but, you know, it is not good educational policy to base admissions, any kind of high-stakes decision like this in education, on a single test. You know, all of the education experts, all of the social scientists really say this is not the best way to assess merit. All it really tests is how well you did on one day, on one test, maybe how much your parents could pay for test prep, but it doesn't actually show whether or not a kid is the most academically deserving, meritorious, any of those things to actually attend the schools.
Could we prepare the students better? I know one of the things that was thrown out, and I know the Department of Education hasn't made an official reply, but one of the things that was thrown out, well, you know what, then we can make tutoring available. If we made tutoring available in a more general way, would you think that, gee whiz, that would be worthwhile?
Well, you know, the city actually has taken some steps to provide tutoring to kids who can't afford it.
To a wider range.
To a wider range, and you know, we certainly applaud that effort, but we also don't think that it's the solution to prepare kids for a test that might not actually be testing anything. They should be, you know, kids are going to test prep after school, on weekends, during summers, preparing for a single test for 2.5 hours instead of actually focusing that time on actual academic learning, school learning. This is all about just studying for a test.
You know, one more question, and then Dr. Hockett comes into the dialogue. It seems to me you're up climbing a very difficult climb, because the city and many educational institutions, maybe even across the country, are saying this is how we're judging. Everything is being judged by a test. Promotion to the next grade, various other kinds of standing. We're evaluating schools, teachers, and principals, all based on the testing process. Seems to me you are bucking not only this test, but a trend that is a very large trend. And I wonder, frankly, if you're going to be able to, overhaul this test, but still keep all the other tests.
Yeah, I mean, certainly there is a trend towards using tests, and that's one of the trends. But actually, there's also a sort of trend in the other direction. And if you look at other selective high schools, even in the city, around the state, around the country, as well as looking at colleges and universities, nobody thinks it's a good idea to use only a test as the way to assess merit and who get in. That's just not the way that people are doing it now. So really the trend is away from the way that New York is doing it.
Mm-hmm. And that's actually, although I hear a busy signal, did we just lose Dr. Hockett? Is she with us? We'll come back to her in a second, because that was really the segue to bring her in and talk about in other places. What other factors would you like to see involved here then, if it's not just testing, and how else would you do it? I understand with colleges they do an essay, and in many cases they'll do a personal interview. Seems to me the city of New York has no resources to handle anything of that nature.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. And in our complaint, we didn't set forth a specific set of criteria. The idea really is that we need to come up with multiple measures. The complaint itself was filed on behalf of a number of community organizations, and we think it's important that when the policy is changed, that there be input from a lot of these organizations and from other stakeholders, and that we really consider what the best policy is going forward. And yes, it needs to be one that the city can sustain. I mean, a lot of people apply to these schools, and they do need to be able to look at the applications, but they are doing it, for example, at the two Bard schools. They are looking at many measures, and it's working better than it is in the specialized high schools.
We'll get back to this question of resources that the city has and alternatives, but I do want to bring Dr. Hockett into the dialogue. Dr. Hockett, you have a more general view of this, aside from just us here in our little, hold of the Bronx and New York City. Explain to me, is New York City alone in this, or is this really how specialized and high-level high school admissions are handled throughout the country?
Sure. Recently, a colleague, Chester Finn, and I undertook a study of academically selective high schools across the United States. And one part of our chore was really just to first identify how many schools there are that are public schools, publicly funded, whole school models that don't have all kids in an area come there. They have academic criteria. We were able to, using our methods, locate 165 such schools. And through survey and through looking at websites and some other methods, as far as we were able to determine, the 8 selective specialized high schools in New York City are the only schools that do that have
the only schools.
Yeah, the only ones that have students sit for an exam. It's a do or die, and you either do well on the test and you don't, and that's the only method by which they select it.
So what other factors can be considered? And you were away for the moment, but Ms. Kleiman was talking about trying to do other things. But of course, in urban centers and in many educational systems where the resources aren't there, how can you consider other factors? How can we do this in another way that might work?
Sure. Well, I'll give you just Chicago Public Schools as an example. Not that it's perfect, but they do use another method, and they have about 16,000 applicants for 3,000 seats across 9 schools. So it could be comparable. And students there submit their 7th grade report card grades in core subject areas, standardized test scores in reading and math, and then they also take an entrance exam. And each of those elements is worth a certain point value, and a rubric is applied to those criterion. And then those applicants are ranked citywide from high to low, and 30% of seats approximately are given to the top scorers. The remaining seats, the other 70%, are offered to applicants based on their scores relative to other students in their same socioeconomic tier. And just a little bit of explanation on that. Essentially what the city does is they assign each census tract in the city a score that's based on variables that we know actually correlate with educational outcomes, like a median family income, adult educational attainment, how many, the percentage of single-parent households, and other things like that. And then students are selected compared to or relative to students in their same socioeconomic tier, if that makes sense. So that's a pretty big urban system. It's not that it's perfect what they do, but they certainly look at more than one variable, and they try to account for the different things that students bring to the table. So
what's interesting to me about that is because my original thought was, well, you do it like you would do college admissions, and that would require an essay and or a personal interview. But given the size and complexity and, frankly, lack of resources in the New York City system, I would think that was not able to be done. But this really is a statistical understanding based on factors other than just the test. Sounds to me like if they wanted to do it, they could simply compile the numbers, create a system, and do it.
Sure. I mean, I think the most important thing or important questions that the complaint raises is really, even race aside, just asking, why do we do it this way? Does it work? Does it get us what we want? And maybe even most importantly, what do we want? Well, what's the kind of student that we're looking for? And if the city wants to say, well, we're just looking for good test takers, then maybe they should just say that, and then at least it would be aligned the way they select.
Right, there would be something to evaluate. This goes back to something that Ms. Kleiman said right at the outset, and that is, what is the correlation between a student's performance on the test and then their ultimate success either in the high school or did they go to college, and then what ultimately did they do? One would think that those numbers would exist because you'd want to justify it. But I want to go back to something that has been raised already, and that is this idea of other factors. Ms. Hockett, Dr. Hockett, do you know what that would cost to put in a system like that? Because I know the bean counters in the city, that's the first thing they're going to tell us.
Well, yeah, that's not something that we investigated. I mean, I'm sure CPS would be happy to tell the New York City DOE what that's costing them. But,
all right, well, that's why I'm going to bring Ms. Kleiman back. What do you think about the system that you heard? Would that satisfy your organization and satisfy the complaint completely or even partially?
You know, it's hard to tell without us taking a deeper look at it. Certainly, the use of multiple measures makes us much more comfortable. I don't know what the outcomes have been in Chicago, and we'd have to look into it more deeply before sort of officially endorsing that idea as the best way to go forward. And obviously, New York is different than Chicago, all of those things, but it could certainly be an improvement.
You know, the idea of, and I wonder, and we'll get some emails and things, if folks want to, respond or have your input, you can certainly do it on Facebook or send us an email as well. What people would think about their grades in schools, because there can be factors in grades in schools as well. I mean, I know I may have gotten a grade on an algebra, on my report card that maybe I didn't deserve, and then you're making very important judgments based on something also that was not fair or was not perfectly balanced.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. There is no perfect measure, which is exactly why you don't want to use just one measure. So, there have been arguments made about grades. Kids are maybe learning different things in different schools. There's not a uniform grading system in the city. And so if you were relying just on grades, you might have a similar problem. That's why you really want to look at multiple factors.
What was very interesting, and we'll get you both to weigh in on this. This was, I'm going to read you a piece of a Daily News editorial. The low rate of Black and Hispanic admissions reflects nothing so much as the achievement gap as it is generally measured between those minorities and whites. By the time they take the test, many have been trapped in schools so mired in failure that even the best students stand little chance against better prepared white and Asian peers. What they're saying, and they said elsewhere in the editorial, that it's the schools. You know what? It's not the students, and it's not the system of testing or evaluation. It's the schools. If they come from poor schools, they're not going to do well on tests. They won't do well in anything. Is that really what the problem is?
We would certainly not disagree with any statement that there needs to be larger systemic change in the public school system and that there is inequality of access. So yes, that is a real problem. Are we going to be able to change all of that overnight? No. However, there is a problem with this test and the way that these 8 schools are admitting students, and that can help. So it's not one or the other. We're not saying, hey, we're going after this test because we think that the education system in New York City is perfect and all we need to change is this test. We're saying, no, look, there's this single test out there that is bad educational policy. It is not recognizing students with merit. There are definitely Black and Latino students throughout the country, throughout the city, who can be in these schools, who deserve to be in these schools, and their merit is not being recognized by the test. So yes, change. We do need to make large-scale change, but that doesn't keep us from making this logical change on a faster basis.
Dr. Hockett, I'm always wary, and we do it frankly in media as well. When we look at demographics and we look at ethnicity and we say, this ethnic group is doing this and this one is doing that, because what it tends to lead to is these kind of affirmative action type systems and programs that, of course, get everybody all upset because they think they're giving somebody a boost up unfairly and maybe artificially driving up percentage of people of color who get admitted. Let's talk about that philosophically. Is this really a valid question to ask, or is this really, it's a free society, everybody has an equal plane, everybody has an equal chance? And unfortunately, some people are, it's a shame, but they are left behind in this way. What's your response to that?
Well, I mean, we're not, the test is not God, and the achievement gap is a national problem. On every standardized test out there, we see the same patterns, and so that's what makes it even more egregious that that in New York we say, we know that this is a pattern, but yet we're going to use that to find and select students for these schools. I mean, it's the real-world equivalent of a doctor telling you whether or not you're healthy based on your blood pressure alone. There's a lot more and different ways to get at identifying kids, not only who have been high-performing and high-achieving relative to national standards, but relative to their peers, and also identifying kids who, under the right conditions, given the right push, would be just as likely to flourish. So again, for me, it's about what are these schools looking for? Are they looking just for good test takers, or are they looking to develop kids who have high performance and high potential.
Yeah, I wonder, I would hesitate to even ask that question, because what if you got the answer back that, well, we're just looking for good test takers? Then that would be the end of the dialogue. You wouldn't have reformed anything, and you would have, at least I guess you would have gotten some information. You had made a comment in an op-ed piece in the Daily News that I thought was interesting. You said the city could just as well have a spelling contest. I thought that was a little drastic, but you're serious about that?
I don't know. I mean, I actually think we might get the same results. We're saying, here's this test, study for it. That's the key to getting in. If we said we're going to have a spelling contest, here's the dictionary, study it, we might just find similar results. I mean, the fact is we don't know, because it's never been studied and it's never been vetted or evaluated in a rigorous way.
Mm-hmm. To me, by the way, just one of the issues that is so large that goes unanswered even through this discussion, and that is the correlation between the people who take the test and what is their ultimate level of success in a high school and beyond. Mm-hmm. But I want to go back to Ms. Kleiman and this idea that I raised of, well, gee whiz, this is a free society, it's a fair society, yet another affirmative action concept. Is that what we're really working with here?
Yeah, a couple of answers to that. I mean, that's not what we're asking for here. There have been some responses to the complaint that what we're asking for is a dumbing down of the admission standards. In fact, we're asking for the exact opposite. We're saying the way that decisions are made now, you're not actually figuring out who has the most academic merit. With a multiple measure system, you would actually be finding highly qualified students, and the result would also be more diversity. Mm-hmm. So we're not asking for any sort of dumbing down of any standards. No lowering standards.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about the potential for success. Any complaint? I mean, you haven't filed a full lawsuit just yet. The mayor's response certainly would not suggest. The mayor said, "Well, sometimes life just isn't fair." I won't even characterize that, regardless of what you feel about this particular issue. How do you see this playing out? And then we're going to go back to Dr. Hockert and ask whether or not we're really at the tip of an iceberg of trying to unravel other things in education if this actually goes through. So what are you looking to do with this first legal action? Sure.
So you're right. This is not a lawsuit. It's actually an administrative complaint that we filed with the U.S. Department of Education and their Office for Civil Rights. I think our chances of success are high. There is a statute, Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, which includes discriminatory impact. So although the mayor said that we're not about equality of results, in fact, under the civil rights laws, results do matter. And not on their own. You need to look to see whether there's, if you see a disparate impact on a certain race or ethnicity, you want to look, well, is there an educational necessity for this policy? And I think, we've shown pretty clearly in our complaint that there is not only no educational necessity, but this is a bad way of doing things. And then the Office of Civil Rights would also look to see, well, are there equally effective, less discriminatory alternatives? And we've also laid those out. And again, that's the multiple measures approach that we've put forward. So, we think that there's a strong chance that they will investigate and find that there is a violation of Title VI of federal civil rights laws.
What have you heard from either people or groups? Give me some of the feedback once you've laid it out. I mean, one of the things you got was an invitation to be on BronxTalk. I know that. I was responsible for that. But what do you hear based on the things that you've put out?
Yeah, I mean, there's been a very strong reaction. I think people feel really strongly about these schools, almost overwhelmingly positive. I think people have felt that this is a really big problem in the schools for a long time. The numbers are so stark that, and it gets reported every single year when the admissions results come out. So we've gotten really strong feelings. I think one of the difficulties has been that the legal case is somewhat complicated. And so people jump to conclusions about what we're claiming. Again, saying, are you asking for lowering of standards? And that's not what we're asking for.
So you'd really welcome a dialogue and a reform without having to really go full-fledged and, have it go through the court system. I'm assuming you would like to just reform the system here.
Yeah, that's what we're looking for. We have a lot of community organizations on board. They want input into the way these decisions get made. And yeah, we would like to have a dialogue and get the policy changed.
Dr. Hockett, let's go back to what I suggested earlier, and that is that if you've got a system, and I'm talking a national education system, not only here in New York, but really everywhere, that is increasingly moving toward the notion of testing and evaluating students and schools and teachers and principals based on tests. Isn't this politically a very, very steep hill to try and climb to get reform on the most elitist, or I don't want to say elitist, the most elite schools, that was a Freudian slip, in the city of New York?
Well, two points on that. I think the fact that the other 150 plus academically selective public high schools don't do it this way certainly bodes well for changing a 40-year-old law. The other thing is, though, too, that people don't always think about with these kinds of schools is that as we are moving toward, for better or worse, looking at the impact that schools have, these schools, because they select kids with high test scores, when they come in, they're actually going to be, I predict, harder pressed to prove that they actually add value to kids, and that they didn't just select the kids who have high test scores, that they actually had an impact on the test results. So that's kind of a different way of looking at it. People really start asking the tough questions about these schools and how we know that they're effective and that it's not just their admissions office that's effective. I think these schools are going to have to ask some tough questions on the exit end of things.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Jessica Hockett, thank you so much for your input this evening. We really appreciate it. One final question for you, Ms. Kleiman. Isn't the city required by law to handle the admissions to testing in this manner? And so you're going to have to get a whole legislative action in order to overturn this?
Yeah, to some degree that's true. There is a law which governs the admissions to 3 of the 8 specialized high schools at Stuyvesant, Bronx Science, and Brooklyn Tech. They are written into the law. The other 5 were named by the city as specialized high schools. They're not named specifically in the law. So it's our understanding that the city could change the process for those 5 high schools immediately. For the other 3, we would eventually need a legislative fix. I think, the city coming out strongly in favor of changing the policy, as well as a finding that this is violating civil rights laws, would provide strong incentive for the state to change the law.
Real quick, what's your next step? Or are you waiting for a response from the Department of Education?
We are waiting to see if they're going to open an investigation.
Your website is on the screen, and anybody who wants to weigh in can do that, can do it on our Facebook page. Rachel Kleiman from the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, thank you. Dr. Jessica Hockert, education consultant, thank you. And folks, if you have further comments or questions on anything you heard on tonight's show or anything going on in the Bronx, then email them to us at bronxtalk@hotmail.com. We'll read them on the air during a future edition of our program. Archives of Bronx Talk are available at bronxnet.org. You click Bronx Talk on the right-hand navigation bar. Also, please become a fan of Bronx Talk on Facebook. You can make comments there. Well, I'll dialogue right with you as we go along. Anyway, please make a note. Next week, we'll celebrate the 18th anniversary of our program with what should be a really special and fun show on that night. Former WNBC sportscaster Len Berman will be our guest. We'll talk sports about his new book, and it's designed for young people. We'll have a really fun time. It's our anniversary show on October 15th, and we'll have one of New York's most beloved sports personalities, Len Berman. We hope you'll join us again. It should be a lot of fun. The gorgeous new set was custom designed for Bronx Talk by BronxNet's Gene Elton, based on an original design by Bronx artist extraordinaire Daniel Haubin. Special thanks to producer Jane Folloro, and also John Moran was our director today. Our cast of thousands, we thank them, and to you, good night. Don't go away.